Welcome, paramedic students, to the first lecture of Human Systems, Module 1, Lesson 1. This is the introduction to the human body covering Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, the chemistry of life, in your textbook from Patton and Thibodeau. You can follow me now and after your courses are done as EMS Guru on Instagram, Twitter. Also find me on SoundCloud as I upload some podcasts, and our YouTube channel, the EMS Chief at gmail.com. We've got two sets of objectives for this lecture because it really does two things. One, it follows the introduction to just the organization of the body, and then it follows our chemistry. So let's first talk about the introduction topics, and then we'll talk about the chemistry topics. So our goal is to identify the terms anatomy and physiology, and to identify the anatomical position and anatomical terms that are used with it, basically applying the first stages of our medical language. We'll define divisions of the thorax, the cranial cavity, and the abdominal cavity, and we'll identify the major membranes associated with each of those structures. On the chemistry side, we're going to talk about basic chemistry terms, and we'll talk about basic chemistry organization, starting from subatomic particles and moving all the way through to discuss bonds and molecules and how they're formed. All of this will be limited to a discussion that is relevant for EMS. Okay, so we start off with some terms, anatomy versus physiology. So anatomy is one half of this discussion. Anatomy is the study of how the body is organized and what the structures of the body are. These are going to be important for patient assessment and determining treatment methods for our patient's conditions. Physiology, on the other hand, is not the structure, but the function. And so the function gives rise to structure, and structure gives rise to function. When we talk about organ systems in the body, I challenge you to think about both the anatomical structures and the function of all of those structures. Most textbooks are going to start off with a level of organization, and levels of organism complexity starts with the smallest building block of life, and that's essentially an atom. The atoms come together to make molecules, and with cell theory, they're going to eventually be enclosed within a vesicle or some type of container that separates the outside from the inside. That's really the function that gave rise to the life that we have here on Earth. All of those cells then come together, and most of them will have similar functions. They'll come together to create tissue. Tissues, and different tissues at that, can come together to create an organ. So on this picture, the brain is the organ. Organs make up parts of organ systems, and so the nervous system would include the brain. And all the organ systems come together to create the organism, you and I. When we talk about medical terminology and anatomical references, we have to have a common framework, meaning that if I talk about a patient's left, it should mean the same thing to you as it does to me and to anyone else who looks at that information without having me describe what I am describing besides that term. So, for instance, when we first started off in EMS, if you didn't have a lot of training and you're asked to document, and you go to document the patient's left side, you might question yourself and say, well, is it my left? Is it his left? Is it stage left? But only one of them can be true, and it has to be the same thing for everybody. So that all starts with our anatomical position. The anatomical position is basically this person standing here, upright, with their arms at the sides, and an important aspect is that their palms are facing forward. You should be able to describe this at all times in your own words, because when we talk about anatomical reference terms, we're always referencing the anatomical position, even if we don't explicitly state it. So remember, this is upright position, facing forward towards the observer, or for our purposes, the provider, and the palms are facing forward. Anything that you see on the front side of this person's body is that front side, including the palms, and anything on the opposite would be the back side of the body, including the top of the hand. Very often, this little piece gets missed in memorization techniques and can be easily remedied just by imagining and visualizing. Now we've got some terminology to add to that. So this really tells us if we had a person in anatomical position, and let's say you froze them, and you picked them up like a sheet of wood, and you laid them down in that anatomical position, what would we call it? So a quick point here, when we're dealing with anatomical positions and any medical terms actually in general, I would encourage you to work on Work on memorizing both a term and its opposite. So if you can find the opposite of a term, memorize it immediately when you're memorizing the primary term. So for example, we compare supine and prone together. These are opposites of each other. So remember, we picked up this person like a sheet of wood. They're still in the anatomical position, and we laid them down. If we laid them on their back facing up, and then their palms would be facing up as well in that anatomical position, we would call that supine. The opposite is if you just took that person and you flipped them over, and now they're laying on their stomach face down, and as you can imagine, the palms are going to be down. Now, this is the prone position. If the person is laying in the prone position, we may have some problems accessing that patient's care. So when we transport patients, we very often transport them in the supine position. Another term, but less used nowadays, is the Trendelenburg term. Trendelenburg is something that would look like this. You have a person laying down and their feet are elevated above the level of their chest and above the level of their head. This used to be used for shock treatment. And in fact, it used to be called the shock position. But we don't do that anymore because of some unintended consequences. Now supine basically is the shock position. We also have a sideways laying. Take this person that is in the anatomical position and place them on their side, and they would be in the lateral recumbent position. If they're laying on their left side, they're left lateral recumbent, and on their right, right lateral recumbent. One other position that's worth noting here that's not noted is going to be Fowler's. Fowler's position is kind of the opposite of Trendelenburg, in which the legs and buttocks are flat on the bed, or the gurney for our purposes, and the head is elevated. This degree here can be variable and still be called Fowler's. Generally, Fowler's is going to be a position of comfort that ranges about 30 to 45 degrees of head elevation. But anywhere within that region that your patient likes, that you also can deal with, would be considered a position of comfort. So don't forget Fowler. Looking at anatomical planes, again, our patient here is still in the anatomical position. We can see that the palms are facing forward here, and they're facing forward. Another nice little touch to some of the diagrams in textbooks is this right here. And this is a key or a compass that tells us when we're looking at the patient, what are the aspects that we're looking at. So in this, we can see that we've got superior, inferior, that's the S and the I, and really right and left. And in this picture, we've got superior and inferior again, and we have anterior and posterior. So a useful little thing to look out for in your textbooks and your diagrams. Now, let's start here with the planes. We're going to actually go backwards. Let's start with the frontal or coronal plane. I start here because it's the easiest one to memorize and understand. The frontal plane is going to separate the person's body in front and back halves, or more specifically, anterior and posterior halves. So you can see this line goes basically down the line of the ear, down the shoulders, down right through the center of the body, and gives us those two halves. And it's front and back is what the separation is, so frontal plane is probably easy to memorize. The transverse plane, or the horizontal plane, is kind of one of the opposites of that, I guess we could say. This is the transverse plane here. And the role of the transverse plane is to separate the person in terms, of course, and not physically, but the role of the transverse plane is to separate the person from top and bottom. Now, if we had a magician and he took this young lady as his assistant and put her into a box, maybe her arms are sticking out here and she's got some big feet sticking out, and he cut her in half right down that section. He would be cutting along the transverse plane. So the transverse plane separates not just top from bottom, but the term we could use is superior and inferior. Let's go to the sagittal plane here, and then we can do the parasagittal. The sagittal plane is one of the last things. The parasagittal is basically the sagittal plane, just done in a different area. The sagittal plane is this one right here, and it separates down the midline of the patient's body. And the midline is basically where the navel is, from the pubic bone all the way up to the top of the forehead and in half. So this is going to separate in the sagittal plane, left and right. Now, when we separate left and right, we're basically separating into lateral positions. The parasagittal plane is the same thing as the sagittal plane as far as how it dissects the body, but we might apply it somewhere like down the thigh and separate the thigh into left and right halves for purposes of description. So we've added some more terms here. We've got on this picture superior and inferior. That's not new. We have anterior towards the front, posterior, that's back in the past, right? Past, post, posterior, so that's the back. We can also add a few more terms that are relevant. So let's look at, before we deal with proximal and distal, let's look at anterior and posterior and give some new terms. So I'll come up here and draw this. So if we have anterior versus posterior, and then we can use similar terms that are fully interchangeable. Let's start with a piece that's easy to memorize. Dorsal. So if we say the word dorsal, what should come to your mind is probably a dorsal fin, like that on a shark or a fish and other water-based mammals. And that's okay because the dorsal fin is on the back of that animal. So dorsal means back for us. So when you hear dorsal, think of back. Memorize again these as complements. The opposite of dorsal, which means front, is ventral. And we're going to see these terms used a little bit later. So hopefully those will help. Anterior, aka ventral, posterior, aka dorsal. Now moving down to proximal and distal. Proximal and distal are commonly misunderstood by new EMT students, and we use them very frequently. So if you commonly misunderstand it, you're commonly going to get it wrong when we use it commonly. That's a lot of commons. So let's use distal and proximal here. So the way that I like to tell my students to memorize this is we've got the person's trunk. Right, here's some arms, there's where the neck is, and there's their head, and they're happy. Apparently he's a cyclops. But here we go. So here's the torso. The torso is basically where we're referencing proximal and distal. It's a relational term. So generally you're going to say this is proximal to this. When you use the term proximal, proximal is within proximity of the trunk. So it means it's closer to the trunk, within proximity of the trunk, proximal. Now, that's a little funky, but let's use this one. This is easier. Distal. Distal is the opposite of proximal. Distal means at a distance away from the trunk. So we can use these terms here. If we say that the person, let's use this young lady here, and let's say that we're trying to describe the elbow as its relation to the wrist. If we were to describe the elbow as it relates to the wrist, we would say that the elbow is closer to the core, within proximity of the core, right? Closer to proximity of the core than the wrist. So we would say that the elbow is proximal to the wrist. But let's say that we want to flip it and say, what is the wrist in relation to the elbow? The wrist is further away from the core than the elbow. So the wrist is distal to the elbow. So those are the terms that we would use. And so we can see here, proximal and distal can be used in our extremities, but we might also use it in even finer detail when we're describing something like a small injury on a patient. Body cavities can be pretty straightforward, so I'll try not to make it more complex than it really is. But we can separate the body cavities into ventral and dorsal sections. Remember, dorsal is to the posterior and ventral is to the anterior or the front. The dorsal body cavities follow along the spinal cord, and so that involves the cranial cavity, which is continuous with the spinal cavity. That's physically separate from our other cavities. So the other important cavities that we discuss are our ventral or anterior cavities, and those are going to be the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavity. These other cavities that are highlighted on this slide are actually really important, but they're cavities, and some of them are actually not physically separated from others. What is a physical separation, though, is the physical separation of the diaphragm separating the abdominal cavity from the thoracic cavity. So that is a physical separation, keeping your intestines and things from making their way and pushing up against the lung directly. So if the person takes a deep breath in or out, the intestines might get further up and down within the ribs, but they'll never get into this cavity unless there's a hole in the diaphragm. The thoracic cavities and abdominal cavities can be further divided. So remember, we have our diaphragm here. Let's first talk about the thoracic cavity. The thoracic cavity has basically three structures. In the center here, we have the mediastinum, as you can see in this expanded view. Then on the sides where the lungs live or sit, we have the pleural cavities. The pericardial cavity is within the mediastinum, and the pericardial cavity surrounds the heart with a connective tissue. Now, there's going to be some membranes that we highlight within these spaces, so it's important that we memorize pleural, pericardial, thoracic, the term mediastinum, and then as we get down here, the pelvic cavity in addition to the abdominal cavity. Now let's stick on this slide for a little bit longer and keep talking about these different sections. So there is a pretty good physical structure separating the mediastinum from each lung, and each lung is contained within its own pleural space. Now when we look at the abdominal region, there is a subcavity, and that subcavity is here, and that's the pelvic cavity. The pelvic cavity doesn't have a physical separation that separates the abdominal cavity from the pelvic cavity. But what does separate it, at least in terms of anatomy and physiology, is the height of the pelvic bone. So everything that's basically protected by the pelvic bone would be considered the pelvic cavity. And that line is essentially in line with the top of the iliac crest on the pelvis. The cavities are also important because these cavities hold organs, but they also are expandable and compressible to different degrees. And so if a person has an injury inside their abdomen, these cavities can hold a lot of blood. In fact, if you start bleeding in your abdomen, and the blood starts to pool in the pelvic space, you may not be able to identify any outward signs when the blood accumulates in this spot, in this space, and is not in the blood vessels. You may not be able to see something like the belly getting larger because the pelvis is going to protect it and keep it from expanding. That's dangerous because someone can bleed a lot of their blood volume into the pelvic cavity, and we might never know it unless we do a very good assessment. Also in these spaces, blood can pool and air can pool within the lungs, and also within not necessarily the mediastinum, but to a degree. But in emergency medicine, we would definitely consider it pooling inside the pericardial sac as a problem. Here's good use of some of those terms. So let's just go back in our minds and think about which type of section or plane would this be showing us. Our terms were sagittal, frontal, which is also coronal, transverse, and we have parasagittal as well. What's the answer? Well, the answer is that this is a transverse or horizontal cross section. And now we've looked at this section. Imagine that we took this piece here and we took it off of this person. So now we're looking from the top down or superior to inferior. We're looking down at the heart. So we can see the mediastinum here. These are the pleural spaces with the lungs included. And then we can even see where the dorsal cavity of the cranial vault and spinal column would be. So just another useful term, but we can see in our mind if someone has an injury, like say a big knife jabbed in here, we can visualize this tissue and the subsequent injury that occurred because of our training. Now, still along the lines of cavities, we've got some terms to further identify. So we have the parietal and visceral serous membranes. The serous membrane is found in a lot of spots in the body, especially within the cavities of the body. And the serous membrane is going to help to do a few things like protect and line the inside of that cavity and protect the organs that are there. But there's also a decrease in friction between the organs and the cavity because of some lubricating fluid that exists between the membranes. The membranes here, parietal and visceral, are kind of universal terms for different membranes, but we modify them depending on which part of the body we're talking about. So the first order is to memorize that these different membranes kind of talk about a cavity. So here's our cavity. I'm going to use the lungs as our example. So in this is the lung tissue. And we'll say that this is the inside of your ribs. Here's your ribs. There's your ribs. If you are not a meat eater and this offends you, I do apologize, but it is worth memorizing and visualizing, please bear with me, to help drive home the point. So I'm talking about the lungs here, right? These are the lungs. The cavity, as we identified in the previous slides, is the pleural cavity. So the pleural cavity holds the lungs. These are our ribs. And let's talk about ribs. Ribs, the meat that you eat right off the ribs from various animals, usually pork or beef ribs. Now I bring this to mind because if you've ever had ribs or ever prepared ribs, then you've already identified some of these membranes. In fact, you've eaten, if you've had ribs, the parietal membrane of that animal. So the parietal membrane is lining the inside or underside of the ribs. So here's what I'm kind of trying to paint a picture of. When you eat the ribs, the underside of the ribs has that kind of tough but crunchy and very shiny in appearance lining of tissue. It's not muscle and it's not bone. That, in fact, is the parietal, we'll use blue for that. That is the parietal pleura of that animal. And so you ate the parietal membrane of that animal. So here's how we modify it. Parietal is always going to describe the inside of the cavity, the membrane lining the inside of the cavity. We use pleura here because we're talking about the lungs. We'll use green for our next membrane. The membrane that is lining the inside of the cavity that is on top of, so there's a cavity, this space here, the membrane that's on top of the organ is visceral. Generally, when we talk about visceral, the term visceral is referring to organs. If you memorize that the term visceral refers to organs, then you'll know that when we talk about a cavity, the visceral membrane of that cavity is on the organ. So this would be the visceral, in this case, pleura. Now, the modified term, pleura, in these terms, is really going to be modified to meet the needs of the cavity. So let's look at how that's applied. In the thoracic cavity, we have the pleural space, which we just talked about, and we have the pericardial cavities. So we would have also a pericardial set of membranes. But let's stop there and apply that in just a moment. The mediastinum is going to have all of these great vessels, big airways, and the heart included in it. So it's a very dangerous area for a person to have an injury. The mediastinum by itself doesn't have actually a lot of membranes lining it in the way that we've described of importance for us, but the pericardial sac would. And so if we're describing the part of the membrane that sits on the heart, that would be, it's an organ, so which pericardium would it be? Visceral or parietal? You got it right if you said visceral. So in this case, visceral is on the heart, and we use the term pericardium to describe the membrane. On the inside of the cavity, we don't have bones necessarily lining this cavity, but we do have tough fibrous tissue. We have the parietal pericardium. If there's an injury to the mediastinum or to the pleural space, we can end up with injuries like tension pneumothorax, in which air is accumulating and collapsing the lung, hemopneumothorax, in which we have both blood and perhaps some air mixing in that space, and then a flail chest very often, in which we have a rib section that's broken in two or more places with two or more ribs. That edge of the bone of the rib can tear some of these linings. The abdominal cavity also uses the terms visceral and parietal, but we modify it to meet the abdominal cavity's membrane, which is the peritoneum. The peritoneum is going to cover the abdominal organs and the inside of the abdomen. But really, we have another layer, and that's called the mesentery. The mesentery is going to be on top of all of the abdominal organs, like the colon, the small intestine, and other various organs in the abdomen. So really, when we talk about the visceral peritoneum, the visceral is going to be the mesentery. And then on the inside of the abdominal cavity, we have the parietal peritoneum. When we're describing the abdominal cavity, it's really hard for us to visualize what's inside the body and describe that to other people unless we have another standard form. And so instead of saying something is 2 centimeters lower than the right side of the ribs, which could be many different places along the ribs and not very specific, even though it sounds such, that would actually be very difficult for us to find. But if we want to figure out what part of the body is injured, we can use the 4-quadrant system as a very general and large surface area description, or we can get kind of zoomed in and get a more finite description with the 9 regions. So let's look at these on this diagram. So this is the 4 quadrants. Basically, the navel would be located here, and we create both a sagittal plane and a transverse plane separating the upper and left and right sections and lower section of the abdomen. So the point of this is so that you can memorize which organs are located in the abdominal quadrant. So the liver is major location is within the right upper quadrant, but it does have some of its structure in the left upper quadrant. So when memorizing, if somebody has a stab wound right here, you could say, because it's in the right upper quadrant and you've memorized those abdominal organs, you can say that it probably, as our picture suggests, has lacerated small, large intestine, perhaps some of the stomach, maybe, depending on how the person was breathing, a little bit of the liver, and perhaps other organs as well. So this is a good description, especially at the EMT basic level. But if we want to get more precise, the paramedic level does require that we memorize the 9 regions. The 9 regions are pretty easy to memorize. We just have to decode them a little bit. So let's start here. The epigastric region is going to be the region in which we find the stomach. Epi a lot of times refers to on top of or more superficial than. So this is the region on top of epi, on top of the gastric, which is basically above the stomach. So the epigastric region includes this section of the abdomen and the structures within. Let's go downward because that actually is the easiest section. The umbilical region is basically the square region around the umbilical cord. The hypogastric region below the stomach, the hypogastric region basically involves the area in which the symphysis pubis is connecting the 2 halves of your pelvis. Now, on both left and right sides, they have the same terms associated with each level. So this level here has an interesting name, the hypochondriac region. Now, hypochondriac does not refer to the whole reason that WebMD is so popular, people's anxiety about getting diseases and illnesses, and the ability to kind of inflame that anxiety. No, we're really actually using the medical term chondral, and chondral refers to essentially the ribs. More appropriately, it does refer to generally the cartilage of the ribs. So hypochondriac, below the chondral region. So if you memorize that, there's a left and right side for that. So that's the sideward sections that cover the abdomen just below the costal margin. Now here we have the lumbar region that extends from basically the bottom of the hypochondriac to the top of the pelvis. And then finally we have two terms, the iliac and the inguinal regions of, excuse me, the nine regions. The iliac comes from the iliac crest of the abdomen, which we can see here, and the inguinal basically refers to the area where the groin is located. So inguinal referring to this region here. So now as a paramedic student, I do encourage you to memorize the 9 regions in addition to the 4 quadrants. Further, we can talk about the abdominal cavity and anterior and posterior. So we have this term retro, right? So maybe this color green is the color that would be retro. All the stuff in the 60s, 70s, and maybe even back to the 50s had these really interesting colors, like maybe mauve. I don't know if that's actually the green, but you know, they also had really big shag carpets and really big shag haircuts. Well, thankfully, that's all in the past. And we would say somebody who maybe wears a shirt that's this color and has some shag hair, we might say that they are so retro. So retro means in the past, thank goodness. So retroperitoneal means the back portion of the peritoneum. So in that space, again, it's not a full subdivision with the physical structure. In that space, we have the kidneys, the adrenal gland sitting on top of the kidneys. The pancreas and some other organs tend to move towards the back as they go across the abdomen, and then parts of the colon and the bladder at various points along the retroperitoneal space. The retroperitoneal space would have the same membrane linings as we've discussed earlier. So that concludes the body cavity section. Let's use another example of major subdivisions of the body. The major subdivisions of the body include, for the skeleton, the axial and the appendicular division. So in this picture, we have our axial skeleton as the purplish color. Axial skeleton is the purplish color, and the brown color is our appendicular skeleton. So you can see that basically the axial skeleton is going to follow this axis right down the center of the body. So it involves the skull, the rib cage, and the spinal column. Everything that's not the axial skeleton is the appendicular. So if anyone has referred to your extremities as appendages, that's because they are part of the appendicular skeleton. So that includes the pelvis, commonly misidentified, and the scapula, and the upper and lower extremities. Now let's get into just the overall balance of the human body. More divisions of the body will be found as we talk about different organ systems. The balance of the body uses the terms that you've probably heard before in emergency medicine, and that's homeostasis. I don't really like the term so much, homeostasis, because sometimes this brings about the idea that something is static and not changing. But it couldn't be further through the truth. This is not a static system. It's very dynamic, always changing. So homeostasis is really something that I like to imagine as a scale, a balance. If we have our homeostasis in good equilibrium, it means that things are in balance, and that means that we're probably healthy. Balance is health. Now, what we're balancing here are different tendencies of our organs to do different things at different times. So we have, let's say, if we're looking at the homeostasis of our heart, if your heart rate is within normal limits, it means that it's within a range of probably somewhere between 60 and 100 beats per minute, right? That's probably familiar to you. Well, you don't get a signal from your brain that says beat 60 times per minute. Instead, what ends up being your heart rate is a balance between a signal saying slow your heart rate down and at the same time a signal saying increase your heart rate. And the balance in between is our homeostasis. If we have a disease or an illness, then we probably are describing an imbalance. In fact, it's perfectly acceptable to say that homeostasis being imbalanced is the basic cause of the diseases that we see and the injuries we see. So how does a balance get unbalanced, right? Well, this scale is tipped because this side is heavier than, say, this side. And in doing so, we've thrown off the balance of the body. That means we're probably sick. The body's internal environment gets a lot of feedback, but the internal environment is going to receive information from both the external and internal environment. So we have sensory and central nervous system functions that are going to help regulate the balance of our body. Now, this is basically just showing the major systems of our body in a cube sense. This is the fluid, basically water, that bathes our cells, as we can see. The cells, that interstitial fluid, is basically the water, the blue stuff we see here. Urinary system helps us process that fluid out. Food enters our mouth and makes its way through the digestive tract and leaves the body. But this is an open tube through the entire body. It's just separate from the body through membranes and tissue. All of these things kind of feed to the oxygenation and the circulation status of our body. So all of these things need to really be in balance, or we've got a disease or injury present. The way that we keep balance is by using things called negative and positive feedback loops. We'll first talk about negative feedback loops before we get to positive. The negative feedback loop is the most abundant, that's a U, most abundant type of feedback loop in the body. So what we're seeing here is the body's response in thermoregulation. And that's actually my favorite example of negative feedback. So let's think about this as a house, but it is really your human body. In the house, let's say that you've got a really nice expensive combo thermostat. And this combo thermostat controls both the heater and the air conditioner without you having to do anything like switch over the heater to the air conditioner at the certain points of year. You can just switch a button and say, I want it to be hot. And if the temperature in the house goes down, then the heater will turn on. But in the same day, if the temperature in the house goes up, then the AC will turn on. So this is a feedback loop. One of the big things to get out of a feedback loop that's negative is that negative feedback loops are going to have a process that negate. And so the negative feedback loop in negating means that something is canceled out. So the loop itself cancels out the process when we've met whatever it is that we're trying to meet. So let's look at our thermostat in the human body. This thermostat, if we were looking at it more precisely in the human body, would read 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's where we'll start. Celsius, we can deal with drug calcs later. 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit is where you've set your thermostat. So because of the outward environment, let's say that you're outside and your internal thermostat is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. When you go outside, it's actually a little bit cold. A little bit cold. So that cold wind is decreasing your body temperature. As your body temperature goes down, your body says, okay, let's say that your body temperature goes down to 90.0 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a pretty extreme measure. So at that point, the body needs to try and turn on its heating mechanism. So once this happens, the heater turns on. When the heater turns on, we do things like create more energy. We may shiver, like we have in the picture next to us here, shivering. We'll do all sorts of things to create more heat. That's our furnace. As the temperature goes up, and your body says, okay, we've actually gotten to the point where we're back at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, the furnace receives that information and turns off. Now, the converse could be true. Let's say that it's hot outside. If our thermostat's set for 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit and outside the temperature goes to 100 and our body temperature goes to 100, then we turn on the AC. We bring down our body temperature through the air conditioner, just like we did here. We get to 98.6 and the process is negated because we met our goal. That's a negative feedback loop. Other examples of negative feedback loop would be not just thermoregulation, but perhaps a good example is the use of glucose in our body. When we take glucose into our body, it enters our bloodstream. If we don't need to have that sugar available for work right now, we'll store it. And we're using something like a thermostat to say, or a glucometer basically in our blood to say, oh, we're not doing work. That's perfectly enough sugar. Let's stop using sugar in the bloodstream and start building it up for storage for later. Very similar process. Again, the sugar level meeting the required level of the body negates the feedback loop or turns off the process. Now, this is more complex, the positive feedback loop. The positive feedback loop is less common in the human body, but what happens in a positive feedback loop is not the process of negating, but I would say we propel. We propel our positive feedback loop in the way that we amplify things until nothing further can happen because we've used up everything. So in the example here, we see the process of labor. So the brain is receiving information that says that the child, this is our variable, the child is moved into position in the birth canal, and we can see the child is head first and ready essentially to be born. Once the child moves into that position, some parts of the uterus are going to receive some stretch pressure, and that pressure basically tells the brain, hey, the baby's here, ready to move. The brain then sends some signals to the body that are going to start to increase the uterine muscle contraction, and we end up with basically labor contractions. Now, what do you know about labor contractions? What happens to contractions over time? Over time, as the clock ticks, our contractions are going to get more forceful, more sustained, more force. They're going to happen for longer periods, and they're going to happen more frequently. And this will happen until the baby is born. So with this, we can see that as the baby gets to this position, the feedback loop basically propels and intensifies the uterine contractions so that the baby can be delivered to the outside world. The force, length and contraction, and the frequency of contractions amplifies not until we shut the system off, but until the baby is born and the feedback loop is done. There is no need for the person to propel their feedback loop any further. So those are the big differences between positive and negative feedback loops, and I hope that will help you differentiate the two. The next lecture in this will be a lecture on the chemistry of life.